Welcome again. Greetings in the name of our Lord. This is another in the series of tapes that we are doing on the subject of biblical polygyny. Does the Bible consider it acceptable, or does the Bible condemn it? This time we're looking at the story of Lamech in the book of Genesis in chapter 4. This is significant because even though Lamech is not well known by people, this is what is called the first instance of polygyny mentioned in the Bible. People who are involved in hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, say that there is a law of first mention. So we want to be particularly cautious to see what this story teaches us. It's found in Genesis 4:17, and again I will read it to you from the NASB, New American Standard Bible. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. He built a city and named the city after his son Enoch. Now to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mahushael, and Mahushael became the father of Methushael, and Methushael became the father of Lamech. Lamech took to himself two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. As for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forager of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was named Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, "Listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. That's the text. Now the facts of the story, just to rehearse them again. Lamech was the sixth from Cain. Lamech was the first to be said to have taken two wives. Lamech's children were fathers of elements of civilization, animal husbandry, musicology, and metallurgy. Lamech got into a fight and killed someone who wounded him, and Lamech claimed the kind of protection that God gave to Cain, and more so. Some points about this story. Regarding non-polygamous matters, there are two associations between Lamech and his ancestor Cain. One stated in the text of the story, raised by Lamech himself, and the other known by comparison of the Lamech story with the preceding story of Cain and Abel. Cain founded a city with Lamech's children fathering aspects of civilization. We infer the relationship between those two. The second matter then is Cain and Lamech were involved with violence. Both of them were. Cain was completely unjustified by what he did, and Lamech may have been justified, though perhaps still implying blood guilt. If we were to consider the later passage in the law, Exodus 22:2-3, which is raised by most ethicists to deal with the subject of self-defense, we would say that there could be some justification here for Lamech, but we don't really know. If it wasn't justified, then he would be guilty of manslaughter, and it would be considered a kind of murder, although I would have to say I don't believe that it is as bad as what Cain did. Now, regarding polygyny, there is no association, aside from the presence of that behavior in the same story. It's just not a condemnation made by the narrator of Lamech's homicide. There is no condemnation by the narrator of the story for his polygyny. His account seems to prepare us instead for the later negative evaluation of society, Cainite as well as Sethite, for the violent practices of all creatures before the flood, and which is cited as a cause of God bringing the flood on as judgment in Genesis 6:11. Now, what are some of the valid and invalid conclusions to be drawn from this story? Let's take the invalid first. Cain's line was completely comprised, this is the statement of people who are drawing this inference from the text. Those who oppose polygyny, they will give these kinds of statements. Cain's line was completely, entirely comprised of sinful and violent men. How do we respond to that? Well, there's no evidence that his wives or sons were violent or anybody else between Cain and Lamech. The only person who is said to have committed a violent act after Cain was Lamech. Secondly, Lamech's polygyny is an additional sin to his murder. That's what we are told. He was a murderer, we know that. But now we find out also that, look, there it is, polygyny. He was guilty of 2 sins. Now, even if Lamech is a murderer, there is no indication that the narrator considers Lamech's polygyny to be a sin. Associating them is simply guilt by association. And if proximity in a story is enough to draw a condemnation, then we got to be willing to both justify polygyny when it's committed by a good man, for example, Abraham and David, or condemn those men as being not good because, after all, they practiced polygyny. They are only willing to say that a good man, these are the people that adopt this argument, they're only willing to say that a good man sinned when he practiced polygyny. Whereas if a bad man does it, that shows that polygyny itself is wrong simply because he's a bad man. It's also said in dealing with this passage by those who do not like polygyny and believe this first reference shows how bad polygyny is, that Lamech was the 7th from Adam through Cain. Therefore, he is the epitome or fullness of the sinfulness of Cain. This is to be contrasted, as the narrator does in the next chapter, with Enoch, who was the 7th from Adam through the godly line of Seth. That's found in Genesis 5, 1 through 24. The problem with statements like this is that Seth is never said to have been godly, nor all his sons. The fact that the comment that people called on the name of the Lord, which can't even be limited to the Sethite line, in the days of Seth's son Enosh in Genesis 4:26, is insufficient to establish godliness of the Sethite line as a whole. And the fact that all men were evil by the time of Noah shows that they were not a godly line. The parallel employs then, using this in parallel form, employs question begging. And of course we realize why these kinds of statements are being made. If the Cainite line was comprised entirely of sinful men, then we are feeling more comfortable in saying about Lamech, well, you know, look what he did. He was in that horrible line of people, and look at what he did. He was involved with polygyny. The problem with this is that if we were to do that, that guilt by association, but compare it to other things in this same story, we end up with something that we really don't want. And that is, we would have to say, then look at the other things that are found in the story. They must be terrible too, because they're a part of this sinful line. So we would condemn those elements of civilization. We would say that animal husbandry was an evil activity. We would say that metallurgy or musicology, that those things are evil things. But we don't do that. Remember when I said before in one of our earlier times that that's a case of cherry picking. You simply go back and you find the one thing that you don't like, polygyny, and you make that a tight association with what you believe that he did wrong, and you ignore all of the other things that you don't want to say that about. And I think that's what's going on here. The other thing is that Lamech is the 7th from Adam through Cain. Well, the problem with this is that we're saying that he was the epitome of Adam, but we want to associate it with his son and not with him. The reason why that's a significant issue is because of the concept of 7th. The 7th is where we find in biblical numerology the idea of a perfection or fullness. So I guess what we're saying here is that that Lamech is the perfection of the evil of Adam, whereas Enoch in the Sethite line is the perfection of goodness. That's kind of an odd way of speaking of Adam, but instead I've even seen some people say that he was the 7th in the line from Cain, but he's not, he's the 6th. So there's some confusion of fact going on there as well. But again, it's a lot of inference, a lot of reading what you want to into the text. Now, what are some valid things that we can say? By looking at this story, I would have to say this, that in this first mention of polygyny, it isn't condemned. Silence and guilt by association are not valid basis for assessing condemnation. The burden of proof is that it now rests even heavier upon those who say that polygyny is wrong. Another thing I would say about this particular passage is that it shows there is no discussion of the wives not getting along. There is no discussion of the kids not getting along. What we find is that the reference to polygyny itself, the first one, gives utterly no indication that there are any problems in the family with polygyny. Now, later on, we're going to find numerous instances of where people who oppose polygyny, like Richard Davidson, Walter Kaiser, and others like that, are going to come back and they're going to try and dump on polygyny by talking about the things that go on there. There's no necessary association either with violence in the story. That's not to be found either. Now, we'll also deal at this particular point with a later event that's found in Genesis chapter 6, and that is the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Richard Davidson, in his book, includes 2 paragraphs attempting to show that one of the sins of the sons of God, that is the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men, the descendants of Cain, was polygyny. He says, quoting Walter Kaiser, "Seeking after as many wives as they wished is where the issue of polygyny comes in." Kaiser said, "It is precisely because of man's autocratic and polygynous ways that God destroyed the earth with a flood. That could hardly be construed as tacit divine approval of polygamy. It is the reverse." Well, whether or not you agree with Davidson's sources regarding the identification of these 2 groups, as to whether it's the sons of Cain and the sons of Seth, and that's highly debated among scholars. The issue is not that the polygyny of the sons is in question. What is in question is the targets of their desire, that they were illicit. If we assume them to be Sethites, then we're talking about interfaith marriages. And of course the Scripture's got all kinds of information about that and condemnation of that. For example, in Deuteronomy 7:3, that comes up. Don't marry the women of the land when you get into the land. And that sort of thing. You find it a lot of other places too. It's found in Exodus, it's found in Ezra, it's found in Nehemiah, it's found in 2 Corinthians. It's all over the Bible. Don't become involved with evil people. So the fact that they chose as many as they want, but happened to choose, that's not so much of an issue as the issue is that they were choosing the wrong people. Now, I would tell you that there is another interpretation of this passage which I think makes a whole lot more sense, and that is that the sons of God were angels and the daughters of men were human women. Now, my personal expositor that I like on this is a fellow by the name of Derek Kidner. He wrote a commentary on this in the IV Press series. I mention Derek especially here because Richard Davidson seems to like Kidner's work elsewhere, but not on this particular passage. What Kidner says is, if the idea of angels having sex with human women bothers your biology or your theology, any other conclusion bothers my grammar. Because, as it turns out, the term sons of God is only found in exactly that formation in Job, and it relates to angels. And not only that, but if you were to compare this story of the sons of God and the daughters of men with Jude 1:6-7 and 2 Peter 2:4, you will find out that they make reference to this particular event. And it shows that what was happening here was simply angelic beings that were having relations with women, and yes, they may have taken as many as they wanted to and taken them for whatever purposes, call it wives, call it marriage, that's fine. But the problem is an intercreature kind of relationship, and for that reason those angels, according to the New Testament, were bound in chains and kept in a place for them for the final judgment time. So whether it's interfaith or intercreature, marriages, that's really the issue here and not polygyny. But of course, if you think polygyny is wrong, then I suppose anything that you say can count against you. All I'm saying is that until we get to the time of the flood, there really isn't any indication at all, either in Genesis, that story, or in the case of Lamech, or the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men. We're still striving to find some sort of biblical teaching that we can say unequivocally is opposed to polygyny. And my friends, it hasn't come yet. We'll continue to look.